What happens when someone spends years building something worth billions, only to be told the moment it succeeds that it was never theirs to begin with? When their work is erased, their truth rewritten, and the very people who should have protected them become the ones who push them out right in front of those about to profit from it. They say family never betrays you, but when power and money are involved, that line disappears faster than anyone wants to admit. So when the truth stands against the people closest to you, do you stay silent to keep the family or speak up to keep yourself? Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next twist in this journey. And now, let's hear her out. My name is Seraphine Voss. If you've ever read about Voss Vector Labs in a headline or heard it mentioned in a room full of investors, you've heard about the future of predictive finance, about breakthrough intelligence, about a company that could reshape how markets think before they move. What you haven't heard is my name. I'm the systems engineer behind the core architecture, the one who wrote the engine everything else runs on. Every prediction, every pattern, every so-called innovation they present to the world traces back to lines of code I wrote, tested, broke, rebuilt, and refined. But I'm not the face of the company. I'm not quoted in interviews. I'm not introduced on stage. Officially, I'm just the lead engineer. I was there before there was a company. Back when it was just a cramped room, secondhand hardware, and a server we assembled ourselves because we couldn't afford anything better. I remember sleeping on the floor next to that machine, waking up to check processes, rewriting modules at 3 in the morning because something didn't feel right. Back then, there were no titles, no hierarchy, just the three of us. My father, Donovan Voss, handled the outside world. He knew how to talk to people, investors, partners, anyone who needed to believe in something before it existed. My mother, Marlene Voss, shaped the narrative. She understood perception, timing, what to say and what not to say, and I built the thing they were selling. At first it felt balanced, necessary even. They needed me. I needed them. That was the story I told myself. Somewhere along the way, that balance shifted. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a moment I could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It was quieter than that, slower, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself. Meetings started happening without me. Not the small ones, not the technical reviews, but the important ones, the ones where decisions were made. I would hear about them afterward, framed as updates instead of discussions. "Oh, we already talked about that," my father would say casually. "It's handled." Handled meant decided. Decided meant I wasn't part of it. When new product directions were presented, I'd recognize pieces of my own work features. I had been experimenting with ideas I hadn't even finished developing. Except now they were fully packaged, polished, and explained in a way I hadn't been part of. Access started to narrow. Shared documents became restricted. Strategy files required permissions I didn't have. When I asked, the answer was always the same, delivered with that same calm certainty that made it sound reasonable. "You just focus on the code," my father would tell me. "I'll handle the rest." And because I wanted to believe him, because I wanted to believe in us, I did. I told myself it made sense. It made that this was how companies grew, that not everything needed to involve everyone. That trust meant letting go of control. Still, something didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way I was introduced when I was mentioned at all, not as the architect, not as the creator, just internal support, the person who helps keep things running. Maybe it was the way decisions reached me only after they were final, or the way conversations would shift the moment I tried to go deeper into the technical side of things, as if that part no longer belonged to me. I started noticing patterns. Small ones, easy to ignore if you wanted to. But once you saw them, they didn't go away. And I've always been good at noticing what others overlook. That's probably why I never deleted anything. Every commit I ever made, every version of the system, every log the servers generated, I kept it all. Not out of paranoia, out of habit, out of discipline. When you build something complex, you learn very quickly that history matters. That one missing record can mean the difference between understanding a system and losing it completely. So I kept everything. At the time, I didn't know why it felt important. I just knew it did. By the end of that phase, I wasn't angry. Not yet. I wasn't even fully aware of what was happening, but I could feel it the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm you can't yet see. I wasn't being pushed out, not directly. I was being rewritten out of something I had built from the ground up. The dinners were always the same. Same house, same long table, same carefully arranged setting that made everything feel more polished than it actually was. Investors, partners, sometimes advisors, people who mattered in ways that translated into numbers and influence. My mother would guide the conversation, my father would lead it, and I would sit beside them, present but invisible. At first I thought I was imagining it. When I tried to explain a part of the system, my mother would gently cut in, smiling, redirecting the conversation somewhere broader. When I added context, my father would shift topics, framing things in terms of growth vision opportunity. If someone asked a technical question, really asked the kind of question that required understanding, they would answer for me. Not incorrectly, just without me. It was subtle, polite, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I was. And over time, I adapted. I spoke less. I waited longer before adding anything. Then I stopped adding anything at all. It became easier that way. Cleaner. No friction, no awkward pauses, no quiet looks exchanged across the table. If I didn't speak, I couldn't be interrupted. If I didn't assert anything, nothing could be taken from me in real time. That's how it starts, I think. Not with confrontation, but with adjustment. Small shifts you make to keep things smooth, to keep things working. You tell yourself it's temporary, that it doesn't really matter, until it does. There were moments, small ones, where something inside me pushed back. When I would sit there listening to them describe something I had built and feel the urge to correct, to clarify, to reclaim. But every time it passed, because every time there was a reason not to. Because every time the room stayed comfortable as long as I stayed quiet. My mother had a way of explaining it that sounded almost like a compliment. "You're better behind the scenes," she told me once. "That's where your strength is." I held on to that longer than I should have. It gave me a place, a role, a reason not to question what was happening. For a while, I believed it. The first real crack didn't come from a conversation. It came from a screen. It was late. The kind of late where the house is quiet enough that every sound feels deliberate. I was checking something routine, nothing unusual, when I noticed a repository I didn't recognize. At first I thought it was a test branch, something experimental. That wouldn't have been unusual. But when I opened it, I knew immediately it wasn't. The structure was familiar, too familiar. The logic, the architecture, it mirrored the system I had built. Not inspired by it, not derived from it. It was it. Except it wasn't. There was no history, no commit trail leading back to its origin, no early versions, no iterative steps. Just a clean, fully formed system as if it had appeared out of nowhere. And my name wasn't anywhere in it. I didn't react. Not outwardly, not immediately. Instead, I started doing what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I observed. I compared file by file. I checked timestamps. I traced references, dependencies, patterns that couldn't be seen on the surface. And the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a separate system. It was a copy, a reconstruction designed to look original. I didn't confront anyone. Not then. There was nothing to gain from asking questions I already knew they wouldn't answer honestly. So I kept digging. That's when I found the server. It wasn't part of our main infrastructure. Separate environment, restricted access. Data had been migrated carefully, selectively. Enough to replicate functionality, not enough to leave obvious traces. Except there are always traces. There were logs, transfer points, small inconsistencies in timing that didn't line up with the official narrative. And the more I followed them, the more a pattern emerged. They weren't experimenting. They were preparing. preparing a version of the system that didn't include me, a version that could stand on its own, legally, structurally, publicly, without ever acknowledging where it came from. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not even hurt, clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't miscommunication or oversight or anything that could be explained away with the right conversation. It was intentional. And once you see something like that for what it is, you can't unsee it. I stopped trying to interpret their actions in the best possible light. I stopped asking why. Instead, I started documenting everything, every discrepancy, every transfer, every version that didn't match what it claimed to be. I stored it offline, organized it, made sure it couldn't be altered or erased. I didn't say anything. I didn't change how I acted. At dinner, I still sat in the same chair. I still listened. I still let conversations pass over me as if I weren't part of them. From the outside, nothing had changed, but internally, everything had. I wasn't trying to hold on to my place anymore. I was waiting, because whatever they were building toward, it wasn't finished yet, and when it was, I would be ready. I didn't go looking for the document. It wasn't labeled in a way that would draw attention. No bold title, no clear signal that it mattered more than anything else stored in that system. It was just another file sitting in a directory. I technically still had access to something that under normal circumstances I might have ignored. But something about the timestamp caught my attention. Recent. Too recent for something I hadn't heard about. I opened it. It took less than a minute to understand what I was looking at. A draft M&A agreement, structured detailed already deep into negotiation language, not exploratory, not speculative. This wasn't a conversation about possibility. This was a document built for execution. I scrolled. Valuation figures appeared first. Numbers that didn't feel real, not because they were exaggerated, but because I knew exactly what they were based on. Every projection, every assumption, those weren't abstract models. They were built on the system I had created. Billions. I kept reading. Company structure, ownership distribution, stakeholder breakdown, technology summary. That's where I slowed down. I looked for my name. Founder, not there. Equity holder, not there. Lead architect, not there. Not even in the technical appendix. It wasn't that I had been minimized. I had been removed completely. I didn't feel shock. Not the kind people expect. No sudden rush, no sharp reaction. It was quieter than that. A narrowing of focus. A shift from uncertainty into something far more precise. Confirmation. The patterns I had been noticing weren't fragments anymore. They fit together. I closed the document and sat there for a moment, not moving, letting the silence settle into something solid. Then I did something I hadn't done before. I asked. I found my father in his office later that evening. He was reviewing something on his screen, posture relaxed like nothing in the world was out of place. I didn't circle around it. Are we selling the company? He didn't look surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. He leaned back slightly, considering the question, then gave the kind of answer designed to sound reasonable without actually saying anything. We're exploring options. Market interest is strong. Exploring options. I held his gaze. That document doesn't look like exploration. A brief pause. Not long enough to acknowledge tension, but long enough to register that I had seen more than he expected. It's preliminary, he said. Nothing's finalized. I let that sit for a second, then asked the only question that mattered. Who owns the code? This time, he didn't hesitate. The company owns everything. The answer came too quickly, too clean. I didn't respond right away. I nodded as if I had accepted it, as if the conversation had reached its natural end. But inside, something shifted again, not emotionally, but structurally, because I knew that wasn't entirely true. That night, I went back through everything. Not the recent files, the old ones, the original agreements, the early-stage documents from before the company had any real value, when everything was still undefined and moving too fast for formal structure to catch up. Most people don't read those documents closely. They assume intent fills in the gaps. I don't. I read every line. There were clauses about contribution, about shared development, about future assignments, but there was no clean transfer of all intellectual property from me as an individual into the company. No absolute language, no comprehensive assignment. There were gaps, and in those gaps, ownership still existed, not in theory, not emotionally, technically, legally. I didn't stop there. I checked recent filings, public records, internal documentation tied to compliance and registration. That's when I found what my mother had been doing. Applications had been submitted, intellectual property claims filed under the company's name, supporting materials attached. But the supporting materials weren't original. They were reconstructed. Metadata had been altered, identifiers removed or replaced, versions presented as foundational that were in reality derivatives. It was careful work, intentional, designed to create a clean narrative, one that could stand up under surface-level scrutiny, but not under depth, not under comparison. I sat back from the screen and let the implications settle. This wasn't just about control anymore. It was about ownership being rewritten in real time, and everything around me, every dinner, every meeting, every conversation I had been part of, shifted meaning. Those weren't family gatherings. They were alignment sessions. Those weren't discussions. They were positioning moves. And I wasn't part of them anymore. Not in the way that mattered. I didn't confront them again. There was no point. Questions would only lead to deflection. Explanations would be shaped, softened, redirected. I had already seen how that worked. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I created full backups of the original system, not just the code, but the history. Every version, every change, every timestamp that tied development back to me. I exported logs, secured them outside the network, built comparisons that could show clearly and without interpretation what was original and what had been modified. I documented everything, quietly, systematically, no announcements, no warnings. From the outside, nothing changed. I still showed up, still sat at the same table, still let conversations move past me without interruption. But internally, I was no longer trying to hold my place. I was preparing for the moment when it wouldn't matter anymore, because when that moment came, I wouldn't need to argue. I would only need to prove. The invitation came like all the others, a dinner. Formal, but not unusual. My parents' house in Hillsborough, the one they used when they wanted everything to look a certain way. Controlled, polished, impressive without trying too hard. 16 seats at the table. That number stood out to me immediately. Too specific, too intentional. By the time I arrived, everything was already in place. The lighting was warm, balanced carefully to make the room feel intimate without losing clarity. The table was set with precision glassware, aligned plates positioned exactly, nothing left to chance. At the far end of the room, a large screen had been set up. That wasn't normal. I didn't ask about it. I didn't need to. The guest list filled in the rest. 2 major investors I recognized immediately. A corporate attorney who didn't attend social events unless there was a reason. A few strategic partners. And one person I hadn't met before, but didn't need to be introduced to understand his role. Adrian Cross. He carried himself like someone who didn't need to prove anything. Observant, measured. The kind of presence that doesn't fill a room loudly but still reshapes it. This wasn't a dinner. It was a stage. And I hadn't been told. I took my seat beside my parents like always. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything was different. I didn't feel excluded anymore. I felt separate, clear, watching instead of participating. The conversations began the way they always did. Light at first, compliments, familiar stories about how far the company had come, how unlikely it had all seemed in the beginning. My father led that part effortlessly. He always did. He spoke about growth, about vision, about the future. He framed the company as something that had evolved organically, shaped by insight and timing. My mother added detail where it mattered, emphasized structure, team, strength, execution. They were good at this, very good. And through all of it, I sat there present in the room but absent from the narrative. No one mentioned me, not once. I didn't expect them to. That part no longer surprised me. What mattered was how consistent it was, how complete. As the evening progressed, the tone shifted gradually. Conversations tightened, attention focused. The screen at the end of the room flickered on. My father stood. He moved into the presentation seamlessly, like it was the natural next step in the evening. Slides appeared, clean, confident, structured, to tell a story that built toward something inevitable. The company's trajectory, market positioning, technology. That's where I paid closest attention. He described the system in broad terms: capabilities, outcomes, competitive edge, but never origin, never authorship. It was framed as the result of a strong, cohesive team, a collective effort, something that existed because the company existed, not because someone had built it. I watched the room. No one questioned it. Why would they? The story made sense. It was complete, except for the part that had been removed. Then one of the investors asked the question I had been waiting for. Who designed the core system? It wasn't aggressive, just direct. The kind of question that usually leads to recognition. My father didn't look at me. "We have a very strong engineering team," he said smoothly. "It's been a collaborative effort from the beginning." Collaborative. The word settled into the room without resistance. No follow-up, no clarification, just acceptance. That's when I understood fully. This wasn't avoidance, it was decision. Deliberate, structured, final. They weren't leaving me out because it was easier. They were leaving me out because it was necessary. For them. For what they were about to do. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the realization settle without reacting to it. The presentation continued. More data, more projections, more confidence, everything leading toward a conclusion that hadn't been stated yet but didn't need to be. I looked at the table, at the documents placed neatly in front of each guest. I had one too. I opened it. My name wasn't there. Not anywhere. I closed it again, carefully placing it back exactly where it had been. By the time my father reached the final slides, I wasn't trying to interpret anything anymore. I wasn't trying to find meaning between the lines. There were no lines left, only what was in front of me. This wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a gathering. It was the final step in removing me from something I had created. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to interrupt it. I didn't feel the need to correct anything. I let it continue. Because the further they went, the clearer everything would become. And when it was finally complete, there would be no version of this where the truth could be folded back into something smaller. So I stayed silent and let them take it as far as they were willing to go. The shift happened gradually, almost politely. The presentation ended, and for a moment the room relaxed. Glasses were refilled, chairs adjusted slightly. Conversations opened back up, but not in the same casual way as before. There was a new layer underneath everything now: focus, expectation, a quiet understanding that something significant had just been set in motion. My mother took control of that transition effortlessly. She always knew how to guide a room without making it obvious. So she said lightly, lifting her glass just enough to draw attention without demanding it. It's always interesting how different people contribute to something like this. The wording was casual, the tone was warm, but I knew exactly where it was going. She turned slightly toward me, just enough to include me in the frame without actually giving me space. Seraphine has always preferred working on her own, she said, smiling as if she were sharing something charming. She's never really been interested in the business side of things. A few people around the table chuckled softly, not loud enough to be cruel, just enough to signal agreement. I didn't respond. I had heard versions of that line before. Many times. each time framed as an explanation, never as a dismissal. But in this room tonight, it carried a different weight. My father picked up where she left off. She's extremely talented, technically. He added his tone, measured, almost generous. But when you're building something at this scale, it takes more than just technical ability. It takes vision, direction. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. The message was clear without eye contact. I felt it then, not as an emotional reaction, but as a structural one. They weren't just removing me from the narrative, they were redefining me inside it. Not the architect, not the creator, just a specialist, limited, replaceable. I watched the room again. No one challenged it. No one asked a follow-up question. No one looked uncomfortable. No one tried to correct the framing. And that was the part that mattered most, because it confirmed something I had already begun to understand. This wasn't just about them. It was about the system around them, the environment that accepted whatever story was presented as long as it was delivered with enough confidence. My mother continued her tone, still light, still controlled. "Some people are just more comfortable staying in their lane," she said. "And that's okay. Not everyone needs to lead." She mentioned another company, another executive, a CTO, who had moved into a visible leadership roles, who had built not just the product, but the story around it. The comparison wasn't direct. It didn't need to be. The implication was enough. I let it pass through the room without interruption, because correcting it wouldn't change anything. Not here. Not like this. My father leaned forward slightly, shifting the conversation back toward what actually mattered. "We're entering a transition phase," he said. A significant one. There it was. Not hidden, not softened, just stated. He still didn't look at me. And I understood why. Looking at me would have made it a conversation. This wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. I could feel the attention in the room tightening again. People leaned in, slightly, glasses paused mid-air, the casual tone giving way to something sharper. And then for the first time that evening, someone broke pattern. Adrian Cross. He'd been quiet up to this point, observing, listening, measuring. Now he was watching me, not casually, not out of curiosity, deliberately, waiting. It was the first time all night that someone in that room had looked at me as if I actually mattered to what was happening. I met his gaze briefly. Then I looked away. I didn't give him anything. No reaction, no correction, no signal. Because I already knew what this was building toward, and I needed it to reach that point without interference. Inside, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I felt aligned. Everything they were doing, every word, every omission, every carefully constructed statement was pushing the situation exactly where it needed to go. They were closing every door behind them, and I was letting them. By the time the conversation circled back into broader discussion, I had already made my decision. They were going to take this as far as they could, and I wasn't going to stop them. Because the further they went, the harder it would be to step back. And when the moment came, there would be no space left for anything but the truth. I sat there quiet, composed exactly where they expected me to be, and waited. The room settled again, but not into comfort, into anticipation. My father stood up, lifting his glass, the movement smooth and practiced. He didn't need to call for attention. He already had it. "We'll have billions," he said. It wasn't framed as hope. It was stated as certainty. The words landed cleanly, confidently, and the reaction was immediate. Subtle shifts around the table, a few nods, a quiet acknowledgement from the attorney, a glance exchanged between two investors. This was the moment everything they had been building toward was supposed to solidify. Then he turned to me, directly. For the first time that evening, I was no longer invisible. "Now get out," he said. A pause. Just long enough for the room to register the shift. "You're fired." There was no hesitation in his voice, no attempt to soften it, no ambiguity. It wasn't said in anger. That was what made it precise. This had been decided long before this moment. The room froze, Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough that every small movement suddenly felt amplified. A fork set down, a breath held a fraction too long. They were waiting for me to react, for me to stand up, to argue, to collapse into something emotional that could be dismissed, managed, contained. I didn't. I stayed exactly where I was, and for the first time all night I spoke. So you sold my code. My voice was steady, not confrontational, not uncertain, just clear. It wasn't a question in the way they expected. It was a statement placed in the form of one. My mother laughed. Soft, light, almost amused. We sold our company, she said. The correction was deliberate, precise. It reframed everything in a single sentence. Ownership wasn't individual. It wasn't personal. It belonged to the structure they had built. And by that logic, anything within that structure belonged to them. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Heavier, focused. Every person at that table was now aware that something had shifted beyond the script they had been following. I could feel the attention pressing in from every direction, waiting. My father was watching me closely now, not with curiosity, with expectation. He still believed he understood the outcome, that I would either leave quietly or react in a way that justified what he had just done. I did neither. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move at all, because this wasn't the moment to react. This was the moment to let them believe it was over, that everything had gone exactly the way they planned, that they had removed me cleanly, that the room had accepted it. I could see it in the way my father's posture shifted slightly, in the way my mother leaned back relaxed, as if the hardest part was already done. They thought they had reached the end. They thought the story had closed, and that was exactly where I needed them to be. I sat there still composed, letting the silence stretch just a little longer. Inside, everything was already decided. They had made their choice, and now it was my turn to make mine, not to argue, not to defend, but to bring everything they had tried to remove back into the only place it couldn't be ignored, the truth. I didn't move. My father's words were still hanging in the air, sharp and final, as if they had already closed the door on everything that came before. Around the table, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, expectant, waiting for me to either accept what had just happened or collapse under it. I did neither. I stayed seated, hands resting lightly on the table, breathing steady, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then a chair shifted. Adrian Cross stood. He didn't look at my father. Not at first. He looked at me. Actually, he set his tone calm, controlled, cutting through the tension without raising it. We didn't finalize anything yet. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but precise. The assumption that everything was already done, the quiet certainty my father had built the entire evening around, fractured in place. I saw it ripple through the room in small ways, a slight turn of a head, a glance toward the attorney, a pause in someone's hand mid-motion. My father's posture tightened just enough to notice. Adrian continued, still measured, still composed. "We're not acquiring a company structure," he said. "We're acquiring the core intelligence, the system itself." He let that settle for a moment. "And before anything proceeds, we need to verify ownership." This time, he didn't just look at me. He waited. The room shifted again, but now the focus had changed. It wasn't on my father, it wasn't on the deal, it was on me. I stood, not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to step fully into the center of the moment that had been building all night. "Then you should verify the origin," I said. No emotion, no emphasis, just direction. I opened my laptop. For a brief second, no one moved. Then chairs adjusted. Attention narrowed. The screen became the new focal point, replacing the one my father had used minutes earlier. I didn't explain what I was about to show. I didn't need to. I started with the foundation, the original repository, commit history displayed in full, not filtered, not summarized. Every change, every iteration, every timestamp tracing back to the earliest version of the system long before the company had any structure to claim it. "This is the first commit," I said, pointing to the screen. "Personal account. Date matches initial development phase." No one interrupted. I moved forward. Local builds. Archived versions from my own machine compiled long before any migration. I showed the hash values, clean, exact matches to the system currently being presented as corporate property. Then the logs, server transfers, migration records, the points where data moved from my environment into the company's infrastructure and later into the separate system I had discovered. The timeline aligned. It couldn't be adjusted. It couldn't be reframed. It was all there. Finally, the metadata, files that had been altered, identifiers removed, ownership fields rewritten, not sloppily, not carelessly, but not perfectly either. Nothing ever is. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at my parents. I let the data speak in the only language that mattered in that room: consistency, verification, proof. The reaction wasn't immediate. It spread. The attorney leaned forward first, asking for clarification on specific timestamps. One of the investors stood walking closer to see the screen directly. Another began asking questions, short, precise, directed at no one in particular. My mother tried to interrupt. "This is being taken out of context," she said quickly, her voice sharper than it had been all evening. "You're misinterpreting internal development." I didn't respond. I moved to the next comparison. Side-by-side code structures, original versus reconstructed, differences highlighted, patterns repeated. The room wasn't listening to her anymore. My father spoke next, but his tone had changed. "You went through internal systems without authorization," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a shift, away from the evidence, toward control. "You gave me access," I replied, still calm. "You just didn't expect me to use it." That landed harder than anything else I had said, because it wasn't technical. It was simple and undeniable. I closed the laptop halfway, not shutting it, just pausing the display. There's no signed agreement transferring full intellectual property ownership from me to the company, I said. Not in the original formation documents, not in any revision. The attorney spoke again, more directly now. "Is that accurate?" he asked, looking at my father. No immediate answer. That was answer enough. "The core system," I continued, "is not exclusively owned by the company." Silence. Then Adrian stepped in again. "We cannot proceed under disputed ownership," he said. No hesitation, no negotiation. The attorney nodded. "There are clear indicators of misrepresentation," he added. "This would require immediate review." And just like that, the structure that had been built so carefully over the course of the evening collapsed. Not with noise, with precision. Conversations broke out, overlapping, urgent. Questions moved faster than answers. Phones appeared. Messages were sent. The room, once controlled, became unpredictable. My mother was still speaking, trying to redirect, to contain. My father wasn't. He was watching me. Not with anger, not even with disbelief, with something closer to recognition, as if for the first time he understood exactly what I had done. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment. Everything was where it should have been all along. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply removed the version of the story that didn't hold up under truth. The dinner didn't end. It unraveled. People didn't leave all at once. They peeled away in stages, some quietly gathering their things with careful neutrality. Others, more abruptly, conversations, unfinished questions hanging in the air. The ones who stayed weren't there for the meal anymore. They were there for answers. Voices overlapped. Low controlled at first, then sharper, more direct. The attorney stepped aside to take a call. One of the investors began asking for documentation immediately. Another was already outlining next steps with someone on speaker. The room had shifted from presentation to consequence. I closed my laptop fully this time and stepped back. For the first time that night, I wasn't part of the center anymore, and that was exactly where I needed to be. My father reached me before I made it to the door. "Seraphine." He said, his voice lower, now controlled in a different way. "We need to talk." I stopped, turned, but I didn't step closer. "This can be handled internally," he continued. "There's no reason to escalate this." Internally. The word felt familiar. It had always meant the same thing. Keep it contained. Keep it quiet. Keep it under control. "No," I said. "Just that. Nothing else." My mother joined him a second later, her composure tighter now, less fluid. "You've complicated something that didn't need to be complicated," she said. "This was a strategic decision. You're making it personal." I looked at her. "It was always personal," I said. She shook her head, dismissing that, trying to move past it. "You're jeopardizing everything," she pressed. "The deal, the company I'm defining ownership." I interrupted, not raising my voice, just clarifying. That stopped her. Not because of the words, because of what they implied. "I'm not your employee," I said, "and I'm not just your daughter inside this structure." I held her gaze. "I'm the one who built it." For a moment, neither of them responded. Then my father tried a different approach. "If you stay quiet," he said, more measured, "now we can still fix this." Fix. The same word. The same expectation. Return to the role. Restore the narrative. Let the structure continue. I understood then that nothing had changed for them. Not really. They weren't seeing what had just happened as a shift in reality. They were seeing it as a problem to be managed. And I was still in their minds part of that management. "I'm not fixing this," I said, because there was nothing to fix. There was only something to acknowledge. I left the house without waiting for another response. The air outside felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, clear. The next steps weren't complicated. They were procedural. I contacted a lawyer the next morning, not someone connected to the company, not someone within reach of influence, independent. I provided everything: documentation, logs, original builds, comparative analysis, the gaps in the agreements. We filed immediately, a request to halt the transaction, a formal inquiry into the use of intellectual property. Everything moved quickly after that, because once something like this is visible, it can't be ignored. The review process confirmed what I already knew. The timelines matched. The origins were clear. The reconstructed system could not stand as an independent creation. The company did not have uncontested ownership of the core technology. The deal collapsed, not dramatically, formally. The investigation expanded. Questions moved beyond the transaction itself, into filings, representations, statements made under assumption of ownership that no longer held. My father lost control of the process. My mother tried to contain the narrative, but there was no version of it that aligned with the data, and the system they had built around that narrative couldn't support it anymore. Adrian reached out a few days later. Directly. No intermediaries. "We're still interested," he said, "in the technology, not the company, not the structure, the origin, what you built." He didn't push, didn't negotiate, just presented the possibility. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't understand the opportunity, but because for the first time the decision wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing what came next. My father called once more before everything finalized. "You've destroyed everything," he said. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I answered. "No," I said. I stopped it from continuing under something that wasn't yours. There was nothing else to say after that. When it was over, it wasn't loud. There was no final moment where everything closed at once, just a series of quiet endings. I left the company. I left the structure. I left the version of myself that had stayed in place waiting to be acknowledged. What I kept was simpler: ownership, clarity, my voice, and the understanding that I hadn't lost anything that had ever truly belonged to me. I had only let go of the belief that it ever belonged to them. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't what was taken from us, but what we stayed silent about for far too long. Not every loss is a failure, and not every ending is something to fix. There are moments when walking away quietly is not giving up, but finally choosing to stand on something real, something that doesn't need permission to exist. Maybe what stays with us isn't the conflict itself, but the clarity that follows. The quiet understanding that respect, truth, and dignity aren't things we earn by shrinking. They are things we recognize by no longer denying them. And in that space, something shifts. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to remind us who we are without the noise. If this story resonates in any way, you're always welcome to be part of this space. You can subscribe and stay with us as more stories unfold, stories that we don't just watch, but feel, reflect on, and carry with us in small ways. And if you'd like, you can leave a few lines in the comments. Sometimes even a few words can mean more than we expect. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for sharing this moment with us. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.